The Imperial debate, which was launched in 1765 roughly with the Stamp Act, is one of the great debates about politics in world history. It starts with the issue of representation and ends with the issue of sovereignty. Where does final lawmaking authority rely? It starts with representation because the British pass a Stamp Act. They had been passing various kinds of acts regulating trade. Molasses Act of 1733, for example, regulated trade, but never before had they attempted to have an internal tax on goods, or in this case, paper products in the colonies. And they justified it by saying, well, you're represented in the House of Commons, and therefore it was a legitimate action. And the Americans rejected that outright. They said, we are not represented in the House of Commons, and they invoked well, the British first invoked what they call virtual representation. People are represented even if they don't elect them. And it's a very powerful argument, and it justified the British hodgepodge of electoral systems because they had many people in Manchester and Birmingham, 50,000 people in those burgeoning cities that did not vote for any member of parliament. Nonetheless, they were considered to be represented. Some of the towns, had one town that already slipped into the North Sea and was still sending members of parliament. And Old Sarum had no constituents, but had a lord who appointed members. In other words, in the British system, election was incidental to representation. That's very crucial. Election didn't count. What counted was the mutual feelings that you had, or mutual interests that existed between the representative and the member of parliament and the people of the Commons of England. The Americans retaliated with what they called actual representation. You had to actually vote for someone. You had to actually have the ability to vote to be represented. And that representation should be more or less in proportion to population. Constituencies should not be totally unequal. And so election became central. It became the criterion of representation for the Americans. These are two very different conceptions. Any good Whig in the 18th century had a reverence for Parliament that we would probably have a hard time understanding. The king had been the source of tyranny in the 17th century. Parliament had been the defensive organ that had saved them from the tyranny of the Stuarts. So, and the Bill of Rights that was passed in 1688, 89, is a Bill of Rights directed against the king, not against Parliament. And that's still true today. In other words, freedom of speech and right to assembly and all of those rights that later, many of them got embodied in our own Bill of Rights, were protections against the Crown's tyranny, the Crown's oppression. Parliament is not the source of oppression. It's the source of salvation. Their experience with representation goes back to the 13th century, and by the time they get to the 17th century, the notion that a member of parliament stands for a particular district had just fallen away, and residential requirements of the MPs had fallen away. But in America, you had a very different experience. Within people's memory, they could remember when a town was created in Massachusetts, and every new town gets 2 members to send to the or 2 or more to send to the general court. The same is true in Virginia when you have a new county created. And it could be in people's memories. They would know they would get 2 members to go to the House of Burgesses. So people had a different conception of representation based on this very different historical experience.